Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar entitled Who Pays? Economic Justice and the Cost of a Just and Green Transition. My name is Maria Rombalcera, and it is a real privilege to be moderating this crucial conversation hosted by Oxfam, GB, Christian Aid, and the Centre for Economic and Social Rights as part of the London Climate Action Week. We meet at a pivotal moment in the climate and economic justice movement. This week, governments, civil society, and activists have been gathering in Bonn since last week for the SP62, grappling once again with the unresolved question of who bears the cost and who reaps the benefits of the global responses to the climate crisis. Those negotiations underscore the need to tackle the structural injustices baked in our global financial and economic systems if we are to deliver on the climate commitments in ways that are equitable, effective, and lasting. The upcoming fourth International Conference on Financing for Development, the FFD4, presents a historic opportunity to reshape the global financial architecture, address debt injustices, and radically rethink how climate action is funded and who controls those decisions. And looking ahead, the road to COP30 in Belém, Brazil, runs through these very conversations. It demands that we connect climate ambition with the lived realities of debt, austerity, tax abuse, and fiscal constraints that limit the ability of many countries, especially in the Global South, to chart their own resilient, low-carbon futures. As the Center for Economic and Social Rights, the organization I represent, has long argued, without confronting these structural economic barriers and redistributing both power and resources, the so-called green transition risks reproducing the same patterns of exploitation and exclusion that have defined our extractive and equal global economy. And at the heart of this lies the issue of tax justice. Research, and Francisca will be talking more about it, shows that the idea that there is no money to fund climate action, social protection, and public services is a myth. It's a question of political choices, of reclaiming public resources through fairer, more progressive, and internationally coordinated tax systems, and ending the vast outflows of wealth from the countries that need it most. A just transition must not be financed on the backs of the world's poorest, nor leave essential services underfunded because they aren't seen as profitable investments. And this is why the London Climate Action Week's theme of financing an inclusive and resilient climate transition is so timely, and why today's event matters. We are here to ask what structural change is needed to avoid a green transition that simply reproduces the injustices of the past. How do we redistribute both the cost and the decision-making power? And what practical, credible alternatives already exist to get us there? I'm honored to be joined by a brilliant panel who will bring perspective from global negotiations, frontline communities, economic analysis, and advocacy. Together, we'll explore what it will take to move from rhetoric to structural change, ensuring that those most affected by the climate crisis are not once again asked to pay the highest price for a future that they had little part of shaping. Please feel free to use the Q&A option as soon as you like, because we will be having 2 rounds of questions and further time for Q&A. So thank you very much for joining us for this important discussion on climate justice, financing, and the global transition. And I will be inviting each of the speakers to respond to an opening question first before we move into a broader discussion. So let's begin. Our first speaker is Mariana Paoli, the Global Advocacy Lead for Christian Aid. Mariana, you've been participating in the Bonn climate talks. I think that you are joining us from there at the moment. So what stands out to you as the main challenges or areas in need for progress? And how do you see this linking to the other global processes, such as the financing for development? Mariana, over to you.
Thank you so much, Maria Ando, for the question, and good afternoon from Bonn. Yes, I just came out of the session of the negotiations where countries were having a consultation on what they're called 9.1 article of the Paris Agreement. And why that consultation is happening is because the first challenging that we're seeing here in Bonn is we're lacking a space to negotiate climate finance. There are only two formal processes. One is a roadmap from Baku to Belém, which is the Brazilian, the Azerbaijan presidencies need to present a report during COP30. And the second one is the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue on Article 2.1c, which is an article in the Paris Agreement that aims to align international financial flows with the goals of the 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it has been the first time here in Bonn that negotiators are meeting to advance that agenda, but the same challenges we experienced in Baku remain. And that's because we know how much the new collective quantified goal, which replaced the 100 billion, is absolutely inadequate, does not secure the quality and the quantity of money that developing countries need to address the climate crisis. What was established, the 300 billion of finance and the goal of 1.3 trillion of investment, does not spell out where the money is coming from, how much developed countries will put on the table, how much it's public grants, and what can be expected for the key areas of climate action, for loss and damage, for adaptation and mitigation. So we have a number of unanswered questions from COP29. So we arrive here in Bonn with this agenda fight on this Article 9.1. Why is that important? Because that's the article that talks about what is the provision, public finance, that developed countries must provide to developing countries to address their needs. So while this consultation is happening, we can expect the grounds for this to be brought back again in the agenda for COP30. And this is really key to have that space for accountability of the provision of that climate finance. So this roadmap that has been also discussed here in Bonn, well, it's just a roadmap that will be a report. So it's in the hands of the Brazilian and the Azerbaijan presidencies to either pave the way to answer some of those questions on how developed countries can meet those obligations, or it could also be face a risk as well, a risk in a sense that it could also instead of sending a strong signal in terms of the level of the ambition required, it could lead to more like entrenched injustices, increase the debt burden, or delay the urgency of climate addressing the climate action. So that's why it's really key here to define where and how climate finance will be discussed. And that brings to the heart of the matter, which is what has been proposed up to now. Because last week we had the consultations under this Baku to Belém roadmap and this Article 2.1c, but they felt more like lectures on private finance instead of actual consultations, and that's really concerning because we know public finance in form of grants at scale from developed to developing countries is a matter of justice, equity, reparation. It's about the common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. So what we witnessed in Baku in COP29 last year is that instead of fulfilling their financial obligations under the Paris Agreement and the Climate Convention, developed countries have been promoting private sector finance and private sector first approaches when we know it's not a solution because it profits before needs. Private finance is problematic, it's insufficient and limited for mitigation, it often neglects adaptation, and is completely inadequate for loss and damage. Private finance in the form of loans, corporate investments, carbon offsets, foreign direct investments, tax incentives, guarantees for profit, blended finance, etc., they're all false finance solutions. So what we're witnessing here is on the politics of the governance of climate and decision-making, where the global north, developed countries, are offering these private sector tools, almost like the Trojan horse to the global south, in terms of the wrong solutions, when they might actually, exacerbate the economic and the inequality crisis that the global South is already facing. So what the risk that we have here, and that's where BON and FFD come into place, is a risk on shift of the narrative where from instead of developed countries delivering in their obligations of fulfilling their commitments in terms of the reparation, the climate agenda, etc., there is an incentive then for developed countries to be blamed for not creating the enabling environments. When in fact, it's that narrative, is pervasive and morally wrong, because it is developed countries that need to provide that. And I'm sure my colleagues will touch on how actually the money is out there. It's lack of political will. And it is available. So one of the key things that both in BON and FFD need to do is about reclaiming the role of public finance for climate and development action. So, as it's critical that we increase the fiscal space in the global South and shift financial flows, because more money flows out from the global South to the global North and vice versa, and address the issues of the debt crisis, tax justice, and the need to democratize economic decision making. And that's why when you look at the outcomes of FFD4, which were voted last week, actually, although with the politics of especially Europe and others in the global north trying to weakening the text, we still got a few steps to move forward. I think the first one is the intergovernmental process to address the gaps in the global debt architecture. Even though it was included in the final document, not the way it should have been, but it has been mentioned there. The second one is, for example, some kind of support for debt legislation to bring private creditors to the table and negotiate some kind of debt relief. We also have in the FFD4 text, for example, the need to elevate more democratic global economic governance in international policy forums and inclusive decision making. I know that we didn't get much on the tax convention, but I'm sure that Francesca will address that. But what the heart of climate finance and development finance is really the role of public finance and the need for us to reform the international financial system, and for that to change the structures dominated by the global north. It's time for, especially now with the absence of the US from the process, they walked out of FFD. They're not here in the negotiations in Bonn. It's time for Europe and others to show the leadership and stop blocking progress in the negotiations, both in the climate space and in the FFD and other spaces. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mariana, for that powerful overview and for drawing those vital connections between the climate talks and the broader financial systems. It's clear how interconnected these processes are, and that leads us perfectly to our next speaker. I'm very pleased to now turn to Professor Jayati Ghosh, development economist, professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and co-chair of ICRIC. Professor Ghosh, you've long highlighted how the global financial system entrenches inequality. So what bold fiscal and structural reforms do you believe are most urgent to enable a globally just transition? And what is standing in the way for their implementation? Jayati, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all, Maria, and thank you so much. Mariana, that was just excellent, that overview. I'm so glad that I'm following you, because that really reduces the things I have to say. And I'm delighted that you have highlighted the role of public finance, and let's face it, the blocking role really played by a lot of the governments of the rich countries. So let me just call a spade a spade. I think here we're among friends. We're broadly, I think, like-minded. Let's stop pretending that they're going to do this. Let's stop kidding ourselves that suddenly these rich governments are going to see the light, even the enlightened self-interest of their own governments and their rules, forget their people, and start doing what is so immediately obvious in terms of not just providing what is, just and fair in terms of the basic climate finance, but even in terms of agreeing to the minimum kinds of rules that are necessary to enable just taxation. Unfortunately, this is the world we're in. We're in a world where one country, the US, has declared that it is not only against all multilateralism, it doesn't believe in climate change, it doesn't believe in equity, it doesn't believe in inclusiveness, it doesn't believe in the Sustainable Development Goals, and it would oppose anything internationally that does that. Now, it's one thing to have one rogue country or government, which is a large and important country. What is extremely disturbing is what you were just mentioning, the response of Europe and several other G7 members who have either been supine or effectively doing the same thing. The US is not the only one to have cut aid. Everyone's talking about US aid cuts. But France has done it, Germany has done it, Switzerland has done it, the UK has done it. They're all cutting aid. They're all going along with the US on not necessarily leaving these negotiations, but in operating in ways that really prevent these negotiations from having any real bite to them, any real ambition, as you put it. In these conditions, what can we achieve? Those of us who still believe for many, many reasons that this unjust international financial architecture has to change. And I think really right now, given the way the world is, given the geopolitics, it is coalitions of the willing that are the only solution, which is to say we pressure the governments, public pressure has to be on governments that declare that they are for these solutions or declare that they are in favor of this and go along with some of these, at least a few of these. There has to be public pressure on them to commit. And in Seville, it's not just the FFD outcome document, which is going to be negotiated, which, will be watered down. We know that, and will be much more of a compromise than it already is. But it will also be the Seville platform of action, which will enable different groups of countries to get together. Maybe we should now focus our energies on that, instead of, working and killing ourselves over an outcome document, which, let's admit, is going to be meaningless. Governments that sign on, many governments that sign on, are not going to do a damn thing about it. Excuse my language. But in other words, we are in a world where there is such a degree of cynicism among global leaders. Forget about people being cynical about leaders. The leaders themselves are cynical about their own actions. That just those outcome documents, maybe we should not be killing ourselves over the outcome documents. Maybe we should be focusing on enabling coalitions of the willing, particularly for these issues of domestic fiscal space. And I reiterate, I think the time, we all know that there is a need for massive flows of finance from the rich countries to the poor, for many, many reasons, for ecological debt, for historical colonial debt, for the current ways in which the global system has been manipulated in their favor, because of the currency hierarchies, and because financial flows still flow from the south to the north. Okay, so we know all that. We also know that saying that is not going to make an iota of difference to how these governments behave. They will continue to behave in that way. So what do we do to change this? And also we know that the new thing that has happened is that in its dying days, the US empire has decided that war is the way to preserve its leadership. And once again, we find the usual suspects of UK, Germany, etc., lining up behind them for creating what could potentially really be another global war. These are serious issues. And we also know the impact that would have on any kind of climate transition. I think we have undercounted the massive climate impacts of the wars in Gaza, in Ukraine, but certainly in Gaza, and before that in Syria and the Middle East in general, and so on. They have massive environmental impacts which reverse a lot of the just transition issues. But we're going to see more of that, and we're going to see more of military spending, and we're going to see war and defense spending take priority for G7 and for a lot of their satellite countries. In that world, what do? We first of all reject the idea that we can convert billions to trillions in that very convenient way, which is the whole blended finance, public-private partnership, model which has consistently failed over the last few years. And insofar as we're going to rely on private finance, use a combination of not just carrots, but sticks. In other words, use much more financial regulation to prevent wrong kinds of financial investments, not just brown investments, but investments that actually generate instruments of mass destruction and so on, and prioritize green investments, investments in sustainable development. This can be done through regulation. It has been done before through regulation. A large part of central bank regulation in the Bretton Woods period was really around that. So I think that's one thing we must emphasize, that banking itself and the role of central banks has to change. And that can change within countries. It can change in groups of countries. Financial regulation is best done if it's done in coordination with at least a few other countries. So maybe you will get, I don't know, a group in Latin America or a group working with Latin Americans, with maybe the Spanish government, maybe some other governments, maybe the South African government, maybe African. We can think of coalitions that could work together for financial regulation, for debt relief. Now, what do I mean by debt relief here? We know it's, again, I have just been part of the Vatican's debt commission. Pope Francis actually set this up. And we just released the report yesterday. I'm going to put the link to that report actually in the chat in case you want to see it. But I do believe that many of those proposals are extremely important and necessary. They're not going to happen right now multilaterally. We have to recognize that. We know that. I'm sorry, Maria, I think that went only to you. Let me make it to all the hosts and panelists, and it can be shared. Yeah. Okay. So there are lots of recommendations in terms of the kinds of things that multilaterally we should be doing. But we also know that they're not going to happen in the world today. Let's think then of the things we can do. We can do measures on taxation. Colombia showed us that you can actually impose a wealth tax. As a small middle-income country, you can actually impose wealth taxes on the extreme wealthy, on wealth that is held wherever it is. It doesn't have to be held in your own country. Once you have the automatic exchange of banking information, we can think of ways of tackling multinationals. If we're not allowed to take, the pillar 1, pillar 2 solutions of the OECD, let's impose digital service taxes. Let's increase mining royalties. Let's do a range of things that will actually provide more resources. In terms of debt relief, let's put a cap on debt payments. This is, again, not new. This was done, for example, for Germany in the 1953 London Debt Agreement, where they said you don't ever have to pay debt service more than 5% of your exports. 5%. Can you imagine that in today's world, where most developing countries are paying 15 to 25% of their export revenues on debt? In other words, we can have coalitions of countries that will actually go ahead and do some of these things. They cannot do them alone. They will be small, powerless, and bashed up, but they can do it in coalition. So I really do think increasingly that we should seize the multilateral, shall we say, platforms as opportunities to build coalitions, recognizing that multilateralism on its own is not going to deliver right now, just because of the way the world is. I know this is a really extreme viewpoint, so I look forward to your responses. Thanks.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Jayati. Well, thank you very much, Professor Ghosh, for those honest and incisive insights and for so clearly articulating the systemic barriers we face. It is a sobering but essential reminder of the scale and ambition required. And building on that, I'd like now to bring in a voice from the climate justice frontline. And I am delighted to introduce Rose Kobusinger, a climate justice activist, advocate, and director of the Vital Crest Foundation. Rose, as someone leading from the front lines of the climate crisis, how do you experience the global energy transition in practice? And what does justice look like from the perspective of those being asked to absorb the greenest cost, despite contributing the least to the crisis?
Thank you so much, Maria, and thanks for the previous speakers for, bringing us to speed with what is happening. I'm feeling confused in some way I feel discouraged a little bit, but at the same time, I'm feeling that energy of like, actually, we're not helpless. There's so much that we can do. And speaking about, you know, the energy transition, I'll first give you an example. So I'm from Uganda, and the recent population report shows that about 50% of the people have access to electricity in the country. So 50% do not have. And even the 50% of those that have access to electricity is not actually full access to electricity. They are also counting those ones that have access to solar lanterns, like portable bulbs that you can carry around, and those that have access to small solar home systems that do not provide all the energy services. They can provide some light for a few hours, but all those are counted as part of access to energy. And at the global level, we have 600 million people that don't have access to energy, and 80% of those actually live in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think, and that takes us to the whole discussion about transition. What is Africa transitioning from, first of all? And that is very important. Totally different context, no luxury, much luxury SUVs and coal stations everywhere. No, it's absolutely different. And which makes it very hypocritical to see, for instance, the background that you know, Mariana just talked about, the global financing and what's happening in the SPs. You look at the hypocritic of these countries, that they'll go back to their countries and tell a country like Uganda, oh, you can't do fossil fuels. And I'm an activist, and I'm an environmental activist. I know how, I know the implications of fossil fuels. But at the same time, you look at the global, you know, geopolitics, you look at the politics in, you know, in the energy transition, and you wonder, how do you expect a country? Recently, this month, our national budget was read. 38% of our national budget goes to debt financing and servicing. 38% of our national budget. And that is about 40% of the budget that is going to schools, health, and all the most important sectors. So, and it puts some of us in a very tricky situation. Like, sometimes you can't even know what exactly to do, because right now you have the country that is starting to exploit its fossil fuel resources. You might have heard about the ECO project, and you know how dangerous it is for the climate. But at the same time, you're looking at your community, your family members that have so much hope in the infrastructure that is coming. Personally, I also come from a region that has benefited from a road. We had the most terrible road in the world, and now they have constructed it. And when you tell communities that actually, you know, fossil fuels are a problem to the environment, they're like, no, we don't care. They have brought a new road. You know, they have brought a new hospital. So it is very confusing, especially when we're talking about energy transition and just transition. It's whose transition is it for and by who is very important. And I research on energy access, and what really what saddens me is when we see a lot of the projects that are funded for carbon credits, the so-called improved cook stoves. Do you know when Europe stopped using those kind of cook stoves? Between the 16th and 18th century. But those are the projects being funded in Africa. Centuries much later, those are the projects that are being funded as part of the transition, and the funders and the governments, whoever is doing them, is getting carbon credits from that. And I'm like, who is even defining the kind of energy futures that Africans and communities should go with or should have? And to me, that comes in also us redefining what energy justice, what green transition looks like for ourselves. But that's not happening with the power dynamics that are going on. And that is why I think, whereas we're trying to dismantle, and I think Professor Ghosh just mentioned something like, let's keep our expectations low in terms of thinking those documents are going to produce anything reasonable, at least in the immediate effect, is that what are our organizations, your organizations doing about it? Because what I often find is we'll come here and say these things, but when we go back, our organizations that are actually doing the same things. And for instance, talking about, access to finance, there is nothing that is going to happen if communities, frontline communities, are not put at the forefront. We'll keep calling them frontline, and not forefront, and with no access to resources. And the resources that are there, the grants that are there, they'll ask for, I don't know, how many years of reporting, how many years of experience, how many years of audits. And communities, youth organizations, activist organizations don't have these things. And what are organizations doing? Are we leading by the example? And maybe, I don't know, once we start, like starting from home, they said charity starts at home. Maybe that will some way cascade into the big boys, the big guys, and the drill baby guys of a sort. But I feel that we need to start from within the means that we can, but at the same time not ignore the possibility, the system level kind of changes that we need. And I really like the whole coalition thing. Maybe we don't need everyone on board. Maybe we just need a few movers and shakers and a few early adopters, and that is where we need to start from. And just to continue a little bit, I think my time is almost running out, right? Yeah, and just to continue a little bit, I think what is really important is to take back the conversations and recognize that the communities, the frontline communities, we've said this so many times, and even the decision makers know, they even say it. They'll say, we're trying to put the frontline communities at heart, we are doing that. But in reality, on the ground, it's not happening. It is not happening. But we've seen some good practices. We've seen some people take lead. I've been looking through, trying to look out for grants, and I've been seeing a small little shift on donors not asking for too many questions, asking for things that matter, and easing access to grants for youth, for women, and community and CBOs. And I think that is something to celebrate. Just like for an example, last year I worked on a project on climate and displacement with support from the International Organization for Migration, and they provided my organization, my colleague, and my other youth organization I was collaborating with about 10K USD. And the things we were able to do with that 10,000, they were amused. Like, how were you able to do that? We organized workshops, not like these fancy workshops. We went on the ground with displaced communities, living in displaced camps, brought them together with their leaders, something that had never happened, to co-create solutions, to figure out the pathway for their resettlement and solutions. We brought together over 150 people. We had a documentary because the people that need to be in spaces like SBs and COP don't get that chance. So we brought their stories to COP and amplified them there. We worked on a youth document that we published. Like, we did so much with that very little money. And that is the power with having frontline communities be at the forefront of action.
Thank you. Amazing. Thank you very much, Rose, for centering those lived experiences and for reminding us how the transition gets defined and imposed in some cases, right? And what justice must mean in practice, not just in policy documents. And that's an important framing as we now consider the risks and opportunities of this transition on a broader societal scale. And it is my pleasure now to welcome Dr. Halima Begum, who is the Chief Executive at Oxfam GP. And Dr. Begum, from your perspective, what are the key ingredients of a truly just and inclusive climate transition? And what do you see as the biggest risk if we fail to address structural inequalities in that process? Halima, over to you.
Thank you, Maria. I think I'm gonna go through what I've just heard from Rose and Jayati and Mariana, because in some sense, I think the answer to your question lies really kind of where Rose left off, the justice piece. And And I think I was planning to talk a lot about, public debt, what does a just transition look like, the piece around the energy system being built on colonial extraction. But I think everybody knows this. I think everybody kind of knows what the set piece is around why the climate injustices are as they are. But I did want to focus a little bit on the justice piece, because I think, Jayati, you were saying that, let's face it, those multilateral discussions, those negotiations, this conversation in Bonn or the conversation in Seville around finance for development, what are they actually going to come out with? Documents that are going to change the world? Probably not, but we have some hope around that process, because without that official process, I think things start to feel a little bit anarchic. But I think justice historically has never really come from above, has it? It hasn't really ever come from above. It's always come from below. And so I think there's your answer to the question about what we must be doing. So if justice is to be a center, not an add-on, we've got to ask the question, well, where's it going to come from? It's not going to come from multilateral negotiations. I mean, ultimately, those negotiations, if we did have a impact, they would have the most outsized effect. But at the moment, that space where we get top-down policies and negotiations is closed and closed, and it's just shrinking. So in the absence of agreements that will come from that bigger space, we've got to look at spaces that are led by people-centered movements, so women's movements, people who are leading from the front. I also don't like this phrase, frontline workers, as though that's kind of a separate piece from the leadership piece, but actually lived experience leaders who are going to lead from their spaces to try and invert and flip what the systems piece is not doing for us. So I think we've got to be thinking about ways to empower leaders with lived experience, wherever they may be. Now, this is a London Climate Shout, I think. So I'm going to talk a little bit about marginalized people, not just from the global south, but also marginalized communities of color who are also living in the UK as a direct result of historic injustices around colonial movements, right? So as we know, global south countries and marginalized groups bear the brunt of climate change despite contributing the least. Now, I was ready all here to talk a little bit about Bangladesh, because Bangladesh is known to many people here, and about the climate vulnerabilities in Bangladesh. But actually, I was thinking, even when you use Bangladesh as an example of a country that could be food resilient, but historically, because of the colonial process, the industry and the economy was focused around exporting crops, and therefore leaving many descendants of those families in a situation where they're working in garment industries now that are not so climate resilient. But I didn't really have to think about the descendants of people who are farmers in Bangladesh under colonial rule. Can kind of just look at myself. I'm a descendant of a system in Bangladesh that led to migration in my family to Britain, actually to work in the garment industry, which then, incidentally, in the 1980s, wasn't very competitive and went back to Bangladesh. So my parents, who basically came to work in what was an exploitative garment industry in the East End of London, suddenly found themselves in the 1980s unable to adapt when that industry went back to Bangladesh to exploit ever more workers in Bangladesh, then Vietnam, and so on. So I think this is a realization that unless we can break through that system, that narrative that's all about profit, we're just going to be going around in circles like hamster was. And I think the solution has to come from the people, women's-led movements, because for many decades now, that set piece around what you negotiate from multilateral systems or through G7 countries or through the WTO system, it's all but coming apart now. And the only thing that we know we can have hope in, we have faith in, is in ourselves. I spend a lot of time in official meetings where people talk about the paralysis of politicians. Politicians don't know where to go, what to do. I suspect they do know where to go and what to do, but they're saying that they're paralyzed. Well, in the absence of that, we've got a job ahead, and we've got to mobilize people and people-led movements to break through some of the changes that we want to see. Some of that answer is around debt relief, but I think a bigger piece is around taxing fossil fuels, and as others have said, wealth taxes where they're needed. But I think, thinking a little bit about where we sit and who we're accountable to, I'm sitting in the UK, you know, I've got to think a little bit about the government that I can pressure. That happens to be the UK government. So I think for many INGOs, the question is about legitimacy and who we can pressure. So if we are sitting in the UK, we've got to pressure our governments, maybe some of their multinational companies, maybe the banks that are spending more and more money on fossil fuels that are polluting the rest of the planet, thinking about people-centered campaigns that actually ask Barclays and others to stop investing in companies that are polluting the rest of the planet. That must be the way forward, because nothing else has brought about the kind of system-wide change that we expect to see. So I think this is about fairness. Unless we can bring about a people-centered approach, a working class approach, and not just a middle class led climate movement, then I think we won't get the support that we need behind policies that reduce poverty. And charity, if it is charity, I'd prefer to think of it as solidarity, has to start at home. And in starting solidarity at home, we can think about that bigger climate movement that then moves the big companies that are polluting parts of our world in double-digit ways these days. I mean, the technology is there to pollute even more, and none of it's slowing down. So I think a real big shout out, really, outside of the spaces of negotiators and more with the people. And from my perspective, feminist movements that are going to be leading from the global south, and also movements by people of color in global norths where they are most impacted, need to be leading the climate movement to get to a just transition.
That's great. Thank you very much, Halima, for highlighting both the risk and the pathways forward, and for your points of the lived experiences, leaders and women-led movements, inclusion and systematic change there, which resonate deeply. And to round out this first round of insights, we'll now turn to the crucial issue of climate finance. And our final speaker in this round is Francisca Maga, the Senior Researcher and Advocacy Lead at Tax Justice Network. Francisca, your new report challenges the idea that climate finance is scarce. Can you explain how tax justice reframes the climate finance debate and what this means for the way that we think about fair and sufficient funding? Francisca, over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Does that work? Yep. Okay, brilliant. So thank you so much. I copied the link to our report in one of the chat windows so that people can read up more if they're so interested. And I'm going to try and keep it relatively short and also not just focused on the technicalities of the report, because you have time outside of this brilliant round of speakers to look into that more. But I think it's been absolutely brilliant what has been laid out so far. Both in terms of the negotiations, but then also the bigger picture and the justice and geopolitical implications of what's happening for now. So I'm really, really grateful for these amazing contributions that came before me. And I feel like I can feed in some of the findings of the report quite well here, and for everything to work together. So in the report, we make the argument that as a lot of people on this call and in the movement would agree, there is in fact absolutely no shortage of money, whether it's general public finance or climate finance. What we face is a shortage of power, and specifically the power of governments to raise public funds from those who can most afford to pay. And the question was a little bit, how do we understand this more deeply? What is really this capture, and what is this shortage of power really about? We at TJN felt like we had to elaborate and we had to strengthen this argument a bit more, because I think personally, and I think a lot of people in the movement would agree, that the argument that we can afford more for public finance, including for climate finance, if we were to tax better and introduce a set of, complementary reform measures, including on debt and so on, that argument has been made. Like, how many times have you heard at this point, introducing this sort of tax could pay for X amount of billion for this or that, or even just looking at the windfall taxes that were introduced in the EU following the war in Ukraine. We have a sense by now within the movement, but I really think beyond as well, that there is enormous revenue that is in theory accessible and that could in theory pay for a lot of what governments are struggling with at the moment, including climate finance at home and abroad. So I do think that this argument has been made, and it's very important to make it, of course. And the question is, how do you go a little bit further? How does that argument lead us to really lobby for specific change? So that's where the thinking and the rationale came from, and that's, in my opinion, where tax justice comes in. And again, we don't want to monopolize this space and pretend, that tax justice is the answer to everything when we hear about these huge issues like debt servicing and so on. It's not, but it's part of the answer. And what we looked at in the report is to what extent the climate finance crisis is a crisis specifically of tax sovereignty. And what we mean by that is that many countries, especially in the global south, are structurally constrained in their ability to tax wealth. So multinational profits, including from the fossil fuel sector, even as they face rising climate costs. And in our report, we show that over a third of countries, mainly in the global south, are in a condition where we say tax sovereignty is severely limited, and nearly half are in an endangered position. Nearly half of the countries in the world are in the so-called endangered position. If you want to read up on that, the details are all in the report. And the result of that is a very deep dependency. So a dependency on debt, on donors, on fragmented, on unreliable flows of climate finance that really rarely reflect any kind of national priorities or long-term planning and needs. So I think what tax justice and economic justice more broadly helps us do is reframe climate finance not as a matter of, charity, but one of global economic justice, because it forces us to ask who gets to tax and who decides the rules. And these rules are really, really critical. So while countries in the global north often choose not to tax extreme wealth or corporate profits, that's also an exercising of sovereignty, right? Like we might not like it. We might not like that the UK has never had a wealth tax, that Germany, where I live, the government is doing everything it can to resist implementing a wealth tax. That is a sovereign choice, even though we don't really like it. So why is that captured? And where does that pressure come from? So that's one form of captured, of limited sovereignty to resist the tools that are available to collect the money from those that are most responsible. Whereas in the global south, we make that distinction in the report with a couple of case studies, by the way, the sovereignty is systematically undermined and countries are prevented from doing so, for example, through things like unfair tax treaties, exploitative investment frameworks, and their exclusion from international rulemaking. So that's really why the UN Tax Convention matters so much. And like Mariana, I was in Bonn last week, and it is good to hear the convention mentioned. For example, in the Baku to Belém process that Mariana referenced. And I do think there's really a lot of growing awareness in the climate justice movement as well that this process is happening. But I am worried that it is still treated as an afterthought when it's really, or let's say, a fairly separate process that is, important and laudable, and it's kind of clear why we need it, but not exactly what the co-benefits are of really advancing this quite quickly in the next year or two, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, because it's really central. It offers the first real opportunity to build a global tax system grounded in more equality, cooperation, and justice, and it will have huge climate justice implication. And therefore, it should not be treated entirely separately from the UNFCCC process. And one good reason for that is that it's a UN body where we're looking at a majority process rather than a consensus process. That's really important. It could touch on things like investor-state dispute settlements, which really, affect countries all around the world when they're being litigated against for environmental or climate policies, but it is really very overwhelming reality for countries in the global south. There are lots of examples where countries have to enter these extremely costly negotiations where they're litigating with a multinational, like I say, like a fossil fuel company or another extractive corporation. And obviously, there are huge justice and precedent implications for what that does in terms of the ambition and the progressivity of climate regulation going forward. So that's just to give you an example of how closely the tax convention process is actually related to the UNFCCC process, which, like Mariana said, is very vague on the role of tax and of public finance. So tax sovereignty is not a side issue. It's a precondition for fair and sufficient climate finance, especially in the long term. And while I think initiatives like, the Global Solidarity's mouthful, the task force, which is this kind of coalition of willing countries that are proposing a couple of progressive tax measures to collect revenue from polluters, is gaining a lot of momentum, which is really, really amazing. What we should not, lose out of sight is really the long-term structural reform picture. I'm going to stop here because I'm coughing, and I think it's time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francisca. This is great. And before I say thank you and we move to the second round, I'm going to remind everyone that you have the Q&A. So feel free to ask the questions because we don't see so many. And also another thing is that Francisca will be leaving us at 1:15. So if you have some burning questions about the study, please do ask them as soon as possible. But I also know that Alex Cobham, the Executive Director for the Tax Justice Network, has offered to continue answering some of the questions as well. So we have now finished the first round of questions, and now I'm going to ask you to also link to what the previous speakers have been saying. We are going to follow the same order. And Mariana, I'm going to ask you, given that obviously you are currently in Bonn and what you have presented before, and we have been presenting at the COP, like in Baku last year, remember our panel as well. So we have been pushing for some of the, in terms of the solution for public financing, and we have been, debunking some of the myths of the private financing. So why do you think that this narrative of the private solution, and normally private and debt solution, keep being pushed forward? In whose interest it is, and what would it take really to change it, to make the decision makers see that this is really a false solution? Thank you, Mariana.
Thanks for the question, Maria. Yeah, I think it's really about shifting the responsibility to private sector when we know that it is the responsibility of developed countries to fulfill their financial obligations under the Paris and the Climate Convention, and also because what we see in an environment where there is this refusal, we see this with the shrinking of ODA, for example, where then all the private sector comes as a silver bullet to solve all those issues. We know that private sector is not accountable to the Paris Agreement or the Convention, so you can't really set targets really relying on them. And it's also a shift of narrative of saying it's not the responsibility of the rich countries, and the main problem is that it can become the burden for developing countries who will be blamed for not doing enough to attract those private sector initiatives, all the enabling environments. To some extent, is what Professor Daniela Gabor refers to the Wall Street climate consensus, which is essentially that shift on the narrative of thinking the putting profits before needs and having that as the driver for development and now climate action, when we know they don't work for a number of reasons. So I think the core of the issue is about the shift in responsibility, is about not recognizing that there is a climate debt owed from the global north to the global south, is about a lack of recognition of the reparations, and those who have done the most to explore and cause climate change, they need to repay back. So I think the global north used so much that private sector first narrative as a refusal to put the money on the table, when we know, when we discuss here, that there is enough money out there, just a refusal to put it on its right place. It's time for developed countries to stop hiding behind the false private sector premises, and stop thinking and also using that as a way to continue a colonial system to explore the North, what would be this green colonialism, really in terms of profit making now in the climate agenda, as we're witnessing. We have to call them out.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mariana. So now we are going to turn to Professor Ghosh. And there is a question already in the chat, and Professor Ghosh also has to leave after this intervention. So I'm just going to read it from the chat. Sorry, 1 second. So Professor Ghosh mentioned that South Africa as potential coalition partner to other Global South countries. Here in South Africa, we have a government that is also somewhat resistant and constrained simultaneously by deepening austerity and rejecting wealth taxes. What is the panelist's advice to citizens on a local level for holding government-affiliated financial institutions like Treasury, etc., accountable, especially on climate finance, when so much of finance process remains inaccessible to us, citizens?
This is such a tough question. And it is something I think many of us face. I mean, in my country, my government is not particularly democratically or inclusively inclined in any case. And so it is choosing to deal with the climate transition essentially in terms of assisting cronies rather than in any meaningful way. However, in international negotiations, in fact, the Indian government plays, in general, a broadly, at least in the tax negotiations, they haven't been playing a broadly positive role. There is this contradiction, I find, between what countries say and do sometimes in the global sphere and in the international negotiations and what they do at home. And certainly South Africa has been a very active participant in the attempts to reform the global tax system. Nigeria, another country where there's a lot of opposition to the wealth tax, has been very active in the attempts to reform the international tax system and so on. So there is this contradiction. I think it is very important for us in civil society to keep highlighting that contradiction, to keep emphasizing that, look, this is what you are saying abroad. This is what you are saying needs to happen for minimum justice. And we are not doing this back home, or you are not agreeing to do this back home. So I think we as civil society have to keep highlighting this contradiction and making it more and more difficult for our own governments not to meet the commitments that they are happy to sign on to abroad, because they think it's not going to really matter when they come back. And when they come back, they can then be influenced much more by the corporate lobbies and the rich elites and so on. It's difficult, and I'm not saying it's something that can be done very easily, but the very fact that there is this, if you like, this slightly schizophrenic attitude of some governments, at least, to the international negotiations, and many governments in the Global South who are really quite progressive, radical sounding, pretty impressive in the global negotiations, come back home and don't do any of the things that they have claimed. We should be pointing this out all the time. We should be taking those statements and throwing it back and translating it into all local languages and sending it to people. Rose should be able to be using that in her work. The fact that, the government of Uganda is going around and saying, yes, we demand a situation where we can get electricity to every citizen of Uganda, which is what they're saying. So I think we can actually focus on bringing out those contradictions internally, because we need to do that just to make our governments respond. They are not very responsive to people. We know that. Just like, the globally G7 is not responsive to the rest of the world. I mean, that's how power works, right? But we have to find those niches, and we have to find the ways in which to take those particular things and push them apart, and thin end of the wedge kind of approach.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jayati. So now, Rose, you have a couple of questions for you. So one of them, I'm going to paraphrase them slightly, but one of them mentioned, they said, you mentioned the issue of cook stove carbon credits. So do you feel that voluntary carbon credits can have a positive impact if reformed to work for the communities that they target, given the lack of action from the, sorry, you just changed it. And don't click on the other one before I read it, please. And the other one is like you gave a powerful example of how small grants have enabled real community-driven impact, and what would it look like to scale that kind of support meaningfully, and what needs to shift to enable that to happen. I think that there was another question, but let's stick to these two, and then maybe you can type the others. Thank you. Rose, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So, so on the question of carbon credits, I think we all know that the current carbon credit system does not work for communities, does not work for people. It serves the interest of the polluters. We know that. And our role right now is to, because there's some, how can I say it? There's some positivity that you can see. But the problem that I have with a lot of the carbon projects, I'll give you an example. A project can come to Uganda, and recently, actually, Uganda finalized the carbon credit strategy. So a project can come to Uganda and say, you know what, you have to plant trees here. They are producing whatever they are producing somewhere with lots of pollution, right? But the money they are paying for you to keep trees in that area, and I love trees, don't quote me wrong, I love them too much. But the money they are paying for you to keep those trees for 30 years does not equate to the profits that they get from the pollution that you've facilitated for them through credits. I don't know if I'm explaining it properly. So you keep trees for 30 years with very little pay, whatever dollar they're giving per ton, and most of them are now locking in that cost of the dollar, the price of the dollar per ton. They are locking it in because they know it's going to increase, and they don't want to do that. So they lock in that, and then they'll continue producing, getting lots of profits. And for you, you're stuck with your few trees stuck on that land, and you're not getting any even a fraction of what they've been able to get from the pollution that you've enabled them to continue. And that is where the problem is. The pricing mechanism themselves serve the polluters. The interests serve the polluters. Everything is about the polluter. So are we going to be able to reform it? Possibly. It's possible, but we're going to need a lot of push. We're going to need a lot of advocacy. We're going to need a lot, some of them call it making noise, because when activists talk, they're like, oh, those are noisemakers. Yes, we're going to make that noise. And I'm trying to say that there is potential for carbon credits to facilitate something. But the problem is, if the credits are just to enable the polluters to continue polluting even the emissions that they could have easily eliminated and reduced, then it doesn't make sense at all. And so on the question regarding the grants, Natalie, thanks for that question. So some of the challenges we've been facing is that a lot of donors are not really interested in real projects. And I think I may be touching some of organizations represented here. I'm not saying that I've faced any of that with the organization represented here, but for inward looking, to just look into your organizations. So right now, as we speak, our youth focal point with a youth organization I'm working with are in a camp, in an IDP camp, or the government prefers to call it a transit camp, of people that were displaced by floods in 2020, and they're still living in that camp at the moment. And what we're trying to do is, because they have no access to land, because they were permanently displaced, there's no money to restore them. There's lots of process to get that money to resettle them. And how can the government actually resettle them when they're spending almost 40% of their national budget in servicing loans and stuff? So, and it means our countries are limited in actually investing in real adaptation, real resilience building at our country level, in infrastructure that is climate smart. But what I was trying to say there is that when we apply for grants and we say we want to get, land, irrigatable land for communities that have been displaced, have no access. They lost everything. They had a home, they had a family, they had land, they were farmers, but they lost everything in a day. But organizations like, oh, we only fund capacity building. No one is going to eat capacity building. Yes, capacity building is important, but it's not the most, because if you build someone's capacity and they don't have access to resources, they don't have access to, to land, access to improved seeds, then you're just leaving them in the ocean as a drop, So, and I find unless we see some support for us to scale, we've done training for, like right now, what we're doing actually as we talk, my colleagues are in the field doing climate smart training, climate smart farming training, and we've managed to secure some few acres of land as a model farms where these displaced communities can do their farming and continue their lives with the skills that they already knew, but now we're just enhancing what they already knew. So shifting from, and again, that goes to the needs the needs of communities are being decided elsewhere. They need capacity. That's not all they need. And they're not even interested in living, there's this narrative, oh, climate change is going to cause Africans to all move to Europe. No, that's not why it's happening. Communities want to be resettled in safer areas, need resources, they have their skills, just enhance them, build their resilience, and they'll take over and they'll take charge of their life. And I saw also a question on okay,
Question about Africa's being able to promote Sonos solutions, but I'm going to stop you there and just park that
Yeah.
answer. If that's okay, we are going to go to the next speaker and we will open the next question for Q&A as well. Thank you, Rose. So now I'm going to ask Halima one of the questions from the Q&A, which is how much responsibility do you think that international non-governmental organizations have in maintaining the symmetrical relationship with donors, so overseas development assistance, and communities which underdevelop the just transition because they are compromised by their fundraising and relationship with funders? Halima, over to you.
So how much responsibilities do international INGOs have, and us being complicit in donors and their agenda? I think somebody else should answer that question, but I'll give it a try. I think many INGOs these days are searching for the appropriate ways in which to work on the climate space or in other spaces, precisely to avoid that complicity. So if we are, as INGOs, locked into funding relations or relationships that require us to be complicit and support a donor or a government-led agenda, then I would say that is quite problematic and we should probably step aside quite quickly. But I think it would be fair to say that many international organizations, INGOs, are thinking about their role in relation to what a legitimate campaign action could look like and how we legitimately could support the solidarity piece that Rose and I also alluded to earlier. So I think if we were simply working around, I suppose, providing the civil society input to a G7 consultation in Bonn or Seville next week, then I think we would be complicit. But if we were instead arguing for the kind of work that Rose just described, where we try and shift all our resources to lived experience, movement-led organizations that are holding their own governments to account, to argue and demand a different settlement, a just settlement, then I think we're in a better space. But what that means, though, I mean, I could outline this, but I can outline a vision, but if you look at the structures of international organizations, they don't look like that. Like the vast majority, the lion's share of our resources, they're not really going to people-led movements. They're actually going to deliver some programs, and they're actually focused on advocacy meetings in G7 countries or around it. So until we can actually demonstrate that our resources have gone behind people powered movements, I think we'll struggle to answer that question. And I think that's why the colleague in this group has asked the question, like, how involved and complicit are we? So I think responsible NGOs need to move away from those sorts of complicit ways of working with donor countries, and do so with some humility, maybe. But I do think certain NGOs, let me give a shout out to ActionAid and Christian Aid, because I'm not here just representing Oxfam, right? A lot of the advocacy work with those organizations is focused on the role of debt relief, looking at the evidence piece around 54 countries that are currently in a debt crisis, and they spend more money servicing that debt than actually focusing on public services. This then is fueling the climate crisis. So I think there are really good initiatives underway with international NGOs that are trying to provide the evidence and what is then needed for grassroots movements to be effective. And I think that's the space and the lane that we need to go on. I don't necessarily think that we need to reduce dramatically, but I think we need to shift gear, shift lanes to make sure that when people-powered movements are bringing about more pressure in country, that we can pick up that piece around evidence, arguments that kind of make sense in the global north, sorts of arguments and log frames and evidence pieces that only we listen to each other about. But actually, for the people that are running campaigns, they've got to kind of save lives right now. So there's a piece and an action piece that we can play, but not all of our NGO structures have shifted there. And we need to do better at getting there.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Halima. That's great. Now we have a question from Francisca. She's typing the answer. I don't know, Francisca, whether you want to give a 1-minute reply, or we also have Alex now, who would be happy to also come in.
Yes, I have to drop off, so I typed an answer, and if Alex can complement anything, I will hand over to him. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Francisca. So Alex, who is the CEO for Tax Justice Network, would you like to try to answer this question? Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. And I'm sorry to lower the tone, but Francisca is very busy. I think Francisca's given a specific answer on countries in the global north using wealth taxes, for example, to deliver better. But there's a more generic answer, which is that we know from the evidence across the board that when countries rely more on tax to fund their own expenditure, those countries are better governed. They are more responsive to their citizens. The public services they deliver not only are at a higher level because there's more funding, they're also more inclusive. So public health in particular, we have quite good evidence that public health that is more reliant on tax funding than other sources of funding ends up reaching more people, does more to reduce the inequalities, and therefore does more for outcomes like child or maternal mortality. And so thinking about the kind of shift, if we were to deliver a UN tax convention that fully empowered countries at every income level, re-establish the space for progressive taxation, particularly to combat the kind of cross-border corporate tax abuse that's so rife, or to pursue wealth taxation, what you'd expect to see, on average, all things being equal, are a set of beneficial outcomes. So not just more revenues for better public services at home, more revenues to meet international commitments, but also the reversal of something that we should all be worrying about right now, which is this slide into authoritarian corruption that's going on around the world. We can't forget, we're not bystanders, observers of these terrible things that are happening, whether it's the genocide in Gaza or it's the fall into corruption and authoritarianism in a set of countries. We are participants, and we have collectively significant power about that. And one of the key things that gives us power is tax. Tax is our social superpower. It's the thing that allows us ultimately to hold governments to account. And when we make our government's tax better, as we can by pushing them in the negotiations of the UN Tax Convention, as well as domestically, we have the opportunity to build the kind of governments that we all need, and to bring them to do the things that we all need them to do to protect this planet and our societies. So there's kind of some reason here to feel optimistic, even if everything feels like it's going the wrong way.
Thank you very much, Alex. That's great. Now, I asked Rose as well to park that question, and I know that Mariana also wanted to answer one of the questions, so I'm going to ask Rose first, and then Mariana to answer the other question in the Q&A. And please feel free to let me know if you want to answer some more of the questions in the Q&A. So, Rose, over to you.
Sorry, Maria, which question? Is it in the Q&A?
It was the one that disappeared when I was just like trying to read it halfway through. So in terms of Africa offering some of the solutions rather than being imposed some of the solutions.
Right. That's a very critical one. That's a very important one. So I think it is going to be very tricky and not easy. But I think the problem is us not trying to attack it because we think it's embedded, it's historical, that Africa will continue to be seen as a follower rather than as a leader in a lot of conversations and decisions in the global politics, in the economics and everything. And so such a question actually shows there's already some progress in trying to in recognizing the challenge that Africa continues to be pushed as a follower. Let's look at, for instance, the EV transition. I don't know if I should call it transition, but we're seeing EVs. Lucky enough, and I think this is part of who I am right now, having, studied in the UK and having the experience of having electricity all year long without it ever disappearing for 1 second. I think for me, it was like, I need this for my community. I need this for my country, water, electricity, and it made me think like Africa, unless we start addressing some of these very basic but very important, of course, costly challenges, I think we'll continue not to be seen as leaders. Like in the energy transition, for instance, you look at, we provide the resources, all the challenges happening in Congo are related to resources, in Botswana, in Uganda. Recently, we have like gold deposits that have started bringing lots of words and interest and stuff. I think we need to start refusing some things. And you agree with me that a lot of the agreements that our leaders make, often we don't even know that they're making those deals wherever they're making them from. We don't know what the implications of those deals, because some of the times they're for their own part, they benefit them personally, not benefit the rest of the citizens. So we're going to need to become, how can I say, watchdogs, like trying to watch whatever is happening, what deal is being discussed, and making sure that we bring that accountability internally, but at the same time refusing some things. Because what happens, you get a country that will come and say, oh, Africa, you need a project on cook stoves. That's what the International Funder says. We have some money, we are funding cook stoves. We need to start refusing. Like, no, we can't live all our lives cooking on cook stoves, the so-called cook stoves. We also want to cook more clean, because right now I was doing my research in Rwanda on energy access in refugee camp settings, and I found that some donors are refusing to fund LPG, which is liquefied petroleum, like gas, normal gas for cooking, like gas for cooking, because they are saying it's fossil fuels. And they are funding cook stoves. Imagine, like in a refugee camp, they're saying, oh no, you would continue using cook stoves with I don't know, charcoal or wood or whatever funny fuel. We're not funding fossil fuels. Yet for them, in their households, in their countries, they're using this clean, it's just, we need to start refusing some of these deals. And that means directing what the energy transition, what the green transition looks like in our own context. And we'll need very bold leaders, very bold activists, very bold everyone to start doing that because it's not been the norm. And but I think the young generation is already changing that narrative. We've seen young people stand out and become broad, let's say, refusing, some of exorbitant taxes. Let's say the Gen Z in Kenya, just don't tell the Kenyan president that I say that. But but the Gen Z in Kenya show that solidarity is actually possible. They refused, and the government had to act. So we need to start refusing certain deals, whether they're from our governments or whether they're from donors, the international communities. If they don't work for us, we need to refuse them. And the other thing also is just continuous advocacy, continuous using any space we get, online, in person, advocating for Pan-African led, justice discourses, and just showing by doing too. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, there was another question that just disappeared. Here it is. It's like, and this is going to be for Mariana. So with violence escalating between the US and Iran, climate justice often slips down in priority in the global agenda. As the world continues to be shaped by conflict and militarization, how do we keep climate justice front and center? And before you answer that question, I'm going to ask all the remaining speakers to think of like a 1 to 2 minutes maximum solutions. Quite often we are accused of always identifying problems and not coming up with solutions. So what solutions can we bring, and what would you like them to bring for Bond, for the FFD4, and for the COP? So you can choose. You don't have to say all of them, because I know that this is a really ambitious demand, but I'm going to be asking you that. So Mariana, over to you for the question, the previous one. Mariana, are you still with us? I don't see you. I think that he might have had some sort of problems with the connection because of Bond. So in that case, I'm going to go back to the question in terms of some of the solutions. And Alex, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay, because you seem to be prepared. And I can see Halima is still writing down some of the answers. So I'm going to go for you, Alex, then Halima, and then Rose.
That was not my prepared face. I should have picked up a pen too. Well, look, I think Francisca's report kind of gives our answer. We need our countries, our governments, to get to the position where, and the only way they'll get there, to be clear, politicians don't see the light; they feel the heat, and that means it's not about us waiting for our politicians to do it. It's about us making it impossible for them not to do it. To get to the position where what they negotiate in the UN Tax Convention, which is fully public and where every government, every delegation can be held accountable for the positions they're taking, what they negotiate there empowers all of them to pursue the kind of wealth taxation, the kind of end to corporate tax abuse that is necessary to raise the kind of amounts of money and to re-establish tax sovereignty in the way that we set out in the report, $2.5 trillion or so a year if we get there, that allows every country to move forward much more independently with their own responses to the climate crisis, but also those countries with great responsibility to contribute at the level that they need to everyone's benefit, including their own. None of that's rocket science, and none of it should be politically impossible at all. It's just in the context of this slide towards authoritarianism and corruption, it feels further away perhaps than it should. But that's the challenge to all of us, and it will only happen if all of us collectively meet that challenge. The answers aren't out there; they're here, and it's us who have to deliver them if anyone's going to.
Thank you. Amazing. Thank you very much, Alex. Mariana, you're back with us. If you want to answer both questions, so the one on the geopolitics and the current war, and also something positive in terms of some positive solutions in a couple of minutes as well, please. Thank you.
Sure, I'll start with the one on the geopolitics and militarization. I don't think we can look at the climate negotiations in isolation. with the rest of the world. We cannot have climate justice with war. We cannot have climate justice without economic justice, without gender justice. And we have to recognize those fights are completely interconnected. It's really important at this point in time that we call out emissions from militarization. It's really important that we really call our governments for peace, really against this war. It's important to isolate the US in the politics. The same way we know it's not just about this conflict, but a number of other conflicts that is happening across the board. Like look at, for example, Gaza and the genocide, and ending the siege and in the occupation. So it would be a mistake for us in the climate community to stay focused in our bubble. I cannot just think considering negotiations, the national determined contributions, while this imminent conflict is going on. So I think we have to really connect the dots between different struggles and really call up action. So yeah, I think without those we can't really continue fighting the climate justice in isolation. Sorry, what was the second question, Maria? I think I've lost that.
In terms of being solution driven, because quite often we get accused of only identifying problems, but not proposing solutions.
I mean, I think we have been calling for the solutions out there. It's just that there is a refusal to hear. The global North countries have been refusing to hear those solutions. It's political will. Okay, we explored here how through debt justice and tax justice, it is absolutely possible to find tangible solutions in terms of reclaiming that role of public finance. So I think it is really straightforward, and for like years and decades, economic justice and the climate justice movement now have been behind those solutions. We need them to be heard. And I think that's what we need to, do escalate more and do across the building and the public, and influence our decision makers to make it happen.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mariana. Halima, over to you. Same question.
Unmute myself. Thank you very much. Solutions. So I think a lot of the debt that we talked about, often we don't differentiate between private debt and public debt. And there's a lot of debt that's owed by African countries that is actually owed to private companies in the City of London and the City of London Corporation. So if we were to get to a place, if ever, where that debt could be forgiven, I think that would be a tremendous step in the right direction.